welcome back to our Thematic Intelligence podcast. At Global Data's Thematic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Carolina Pinto, and today I am joined by Christopher Granville, Managing Director of Global Political Research at TS Lombard. Welcome, Christopher. How are you?
Thanks, Carolina. All well. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. So I feel like we have to start off the year talking about elections. 2024 is an unprecedented year with over 40% of the world's population eligible to vote. Elections have already taken place in Taiwan and Bangladesh, with many more to come in the US, UK, India, Indonesia, and Mexico. But my first question is, do these elections actually matter for the political risk that businesses care about?
Well, I think, Carolina, you've started with the right question. Well, why should we care about this? I mean, a huge quantity of elections in a single year. Well, that's kind of a fun fact. But, this is a slightly trivial pursuit. We need to think about why businesses and investors should pay attention to this in the first place. One way of putting some perspective on this is to recall that radical change doesn't necessarily happen overnight as a result of election results at all. Or it can come, let's take an example close to where you and I are sitting, Carolina, here in London, close to home, the UK. A very radical change in the UK came as a result of an election in 2015, which seemed to be a complete non-event. The incumbent ruling party was re-elected. And a few months later, the UK went through a cataclysm of the Brexit referendum. So elections can be overrated. You could say that there are rare cases where an election can produce a radical change. And if you have a lot of elections in a short time, well, statistical probability suggests that there's a slightly more chance that in the time period we're looking at, this calendar year, there might be such a relatively rare radical change caused by an election. For the most part, the elections do need, now I'm getting serious now, they deserve attention. And the reason they deserve attention is that they hold up a mirror. That mirror always applies to the country concerned. And that's important, obviously, if you're a business or investor with exposure. But it matters in the world now, in today's world, even more. Why? Elections, especially in strategically important countries, can not only be a reflection of risks and opportunities for business and investment within the country concerned, but can be a reflection of wider geopolitical tensions which affect global risks for everyone.
I think this leads us very well to talk about Taiwan. So, of course, Taiwan is a very geopolitically important country, but also it's an example of where an incumbent election win may also have serious implications. For our listeners, the Taiwanese election concluded on the 13th of January, and the incumbent Democratic Progressive Party retained power for a third term, but importantly, lost parliamentary majority. What are your key takeaways from this election, Christopher?
Okay, so if I can express those takeaways within the analytical framework I was just setting out, on both those metrics, the Taiwan election result looks pretty negative. For domestic risks, the economy in Taiwan has been sluggish, largely because of the global semiconductor cycle having taken a sharp downturn. That the result you just mentioned, a basically hung result, will make coherent policy difficult. But on the other metric, geopolitical, and this is perhaps the one which will attract wider attention, this also looks negative because the pro-independence candidate, as you mentioned, Lai Ching-te of the Democratic Progressive Party, won the presidential election. So that's more pro-US oriented, more likely to cause tension with China. But the parliamentary majority of that party, the DPP, was lost. So you'll get a more anti-China foreign policy stance coming from the presidency without the backup of the spending. You'll get a Chinese gray zone military intimidation reaction will continue. It will be escalated in reaction to some perceived fault on the part of Taiwan and the United States. And there won't be that defense spending in Taiwan to back up the policy. So you'll just get a more convoluted and contradictory situation. So it looks quite negative for Taiwan assets and a contribution to yet another increase, as if geopolitical tensions weren't high enough already, but yet another increase in geopolitical tension.
So you've spoken about China's response, but amidst US-China tensions, what was US's response to the elections?
I guess that the Biden administration is being very cautious. The President Biden himself took care to reaffirm immediately after the Taiwan election result was announced that the United States does not support independence for Taiwan, although Biden has previously said that that the United States would defend Taiwan if it were attacked by China. So this is a very balanced position, this so-called strategic ambiguity being carefully maintained. But it seems to me that the Biden administration will strive to avoid obvious provocation or even imprudent destabilization of the situation. But objectively, the situation is extremely tense and precarious. And I think your question, Caroline, leads us on to the wider question of United States foreign policy in the context of, if you look at the timetable of this year's global election marathon, the last election on that timetable, the back end of the year in November, it's the United States itself. And might that election have a serious impact on these geopolitical risks?
Well, I think that's definitely the most anticipated elections of the year. Sorry to the UK, but and recently we saw Trump win the Iowa caucuses in a landslide win over majority. What do these results tell us about the November election? Or should businesses expect a second Trump term, or do you think it's too early to tell?
Like a good politician, Caroline, I'm going to start by ducking your question. Because for all the fascination of the result of the US election next November, let's remember that, as in Taiwan, it's not only a presidential election, but also elections to the federal legislature, the Congress. And I'll duck the question by making, I think, what is a point which is more certain, but also more useful and more relevant to everyone concerned with risk management and risk evaluation. And that's the effect of the political tensions, you could say polarization, to some degree hysteria in the United States, the effect of all that now, up front. That doesn't make the result, of course, irrelevant, but it means that for the purpose of analysis, we can concentrate on those upfront effects. And I just pick out two. One, on the economy, I think that our reading would be that the fraught atmosphere created by the possible victory of Donald Trump will make the Federal Reserve extremely dovish in its monetary policy, because in a politically fraught environment, it's very important for a central bank not to be perceived as having tried to put its thumb on the scale. And therefore, you will see a great attention in the Federal Reserve's interest rate setting decisions this year to avoiding recession or even avoiding an uptick in unemployment. That is, although not said explicitly, it will tolerate inflation remaining above its official target of 2% per year. On the geopolitical front, you can see that Donald Trump's grip on the Republican Party, if he's able to be nominated against the backdrop of the various criminal cases being conducted against him in the US courts, this is already having the effect of blocking in the US Congress the supplementary funding bill, which the Biden administration has requested, above all, to fund the war effort of Ukraine, but also funding for Israel. And the Republican majority in the House of Representatives, very much under the influence of Trump, has made approval of this funding conditional on what is, for the Democrat side, seems to be, at the moment at least, a politically impossible list of demands to do with the security of the southern border with Mexico. So you can see an upfront geopolitical effect coming from the US election, regardless of its result. And this makes, of course, the prospects, as top officials in the Biden administration, President Biden himself has been saying, makes the prospect of further military successes for Russia on the Ukrainian battlefield that much more likely, with all the consequences that flow from that. So I guess, ducking the question of the result, we can come to that later. Of course, anyone who says they can predict the result of the US election is bluffing. But you can, because there's plenty to think about beforehand. That's where I would orient.
I think you've laid it out right, that there's a lot more implications regardless of the result, really. And I think Russia-Ukraine is the perfect example of that. Moving on to our next and final question, I think we've addressed Taiwan, we've addressed the US. Is there any other election that we should keep our eyes on?
Well, I argued at the beginning that if you're a business or an investor, strategic or financial investor exposed to a country and it's having a regular election, then you should obviously pay attention. It's probably a banal thing to say, but especially with countries like emerging markets, where a lot of risk and opportunity hinges on government policy. A major country, India, election looks uneventful. The incumbent Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his BJP party look virtually certain to retain their majority in the Indian National Parliament, the lower house, and possibly a reduced majority. But it'll nevertheless be fascinating to watch the details. There is a lot of structural reform in India, which will affect returns on business investment, on financial investment, which will hinge on the extent to which Modi and his BJP party regenerate their political capital, talking about privatization, industrial land banks, liberalizing employment law, a lot of reforms which have been put on hold because they're too difficult, too controversial. So those are quite detailed points, but in an economy of the size and importance of India, they deserve attention. And the same would be true of Mexico. Again, looks like continuity. The outgoing president's party is likely to win to retain its majority in the parliament, but there are big stakes involved in whether the anti-business policy of AMLO will be continued by Claudia Sheinbaum, his likely successor, or whether it'll be moderated, which will give Mexico a better chance of exploiting its potential to be the prime nearshoring location for US business as the US decoupling from China proceeds. So India, Mexico, major strategic economies. What happens in the election is obviously of huge importance to the country's concern, but with some wider implications. Probably we'll end on that.
Well, I think that, to be honest, we've barely scratched the surface on the implications of this year, but hopefully maybe we can have you on the podcast again to talk about these elections once they actually happened. Thank you so much for coming.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure. We'll continue to monitor these results as they unfold during the year. Look forward to it.
Thank you for listening from us at Thematic Intelligence. See you next time.